This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Andrew Scott Cooper, who is the author of The Oil Kings: How the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia Changed the Balance of Power in the Middle East. Andrew, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. When did you get interested in this topic?
Well, I was very young when the Shah was overthrown, and I was always interested in international affairs as a kid. So from about the age of 10, Iran was always in the news, and I was very interested in why the revolution had happened. And really I kept waiting for the book to come out to explain the pre-revolutionary part of the US story in Iran, and that never happened. There were a couple of books that came out, not written by historians, and they weren't investigative, and they were speculating on what might have gone on behind the scenes. So it was really when I was 5.5 years ago, I began my own research while I was working in New York, just for the interest.
Let's do a little background here. So what was it as in this period when the Shah fell, were you just somebody who was interested in current events?
Yeah, from the age of 10.
I see.
I collected newspaper scrapbooks.
I see.
So, the evening newspaper would come home. I would take it from my father. Sometimes I would take it from him, and then I would cut the World News page out, and then I'd give it back to him, and he never noticed it was missing. And then I would cut out the clips that interested me, and I began scrapbooks that over a period of years began multiplying. And then I was able to, I think I really probably learned quite good analytical skills because I was taking subject matter from all over the world and then reading everything very carefully, and then I'd go to the library and do additional research.
And you were based where? Where were you?
In Wellington, New Zealand.
I see. And so was it kind of inevitable that you would become both a journalist and a historian?
Looking back, yes, yeah. I've always loved history, and I began at that same time reading history books and became really absorbed in different topics. So the Russian Revolution was a huge thing with me. And I'm generally interested in revolutions because French, Iranian, and Russian, because of the complexity and the vastness of a big revolution, not a small one, but these big ones. And the case with Iran, I think, was that this big piece of the missing puzzle was the background story to the Nixon and Ford years. And I just kept waiting for someone to write that book, and it never happened. And I thought, well, if no one's going to do the research, I had background as an investigative researcher, and I thought I would start.
Mm-hmm. And when we look at this book, it's quite impressive. You're using both sources in Iran and in the National Security Archives in the United States. And what was the problem of access there to these materials? Were the materials being revealed because enough time had passed, say, with the national security documents?
The big find these are the papers of Brent Scowcroft. Scowcroft was Kissinger's deputy from 73 to late 75, and then he was the national security advisor. And Scowcroft's great asset is that he was the note taker. In every meeting where Iran or oil or Saudi Arabia was discussed, Scowcroft was the silent man in the room keeping the notes. And he was an exemplary note taker. He didn't just summarize conversations as Kissinger did, because Kissinger wanted to control what his colleagues would see coming out of a meeting, but he also wanted to control what scholars and historians would see. And he did a pretty good job of that for about 30 years. But when Scowcroft donated his transcripts to the Ford Library, suddenly we have actual verbatim conversations of what was going on in the Oval Office between the President, Secretary of State, and anyone else in the room, including the Shah. This is the first time we've actually read the Shah speaking in his own words to the highest US officials in privacy, you know, behind the scenes. So the Ford papers were very important. I integrated them with the diaries of Asadullah Alam, the Shah's closest aide at the time. That hadn't been done before. And then my search really branched out. Also, as my research grew, I began having to look for different source materials. And then right at the end, I approached the principals for interviews and was quite pleasantly surprised with the response.
And when you say the principals, you are talking about who, in addition to Scowcroft?
The surviving members of the cabinet who dealt with oil in Iran. You're really only talking about Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, and Frank Zaab was the second energy czar. People think the word czar is a contemporary one for a US cabinet official, but actually Nixon came up with the phrase back in late '73. So it was Zaab and Schlesinger, Scowcroft, US diplomats who had served in Tehran either before or during the revolution. And then on the Iranian side, there are only a couple of people left who could help. And that's because the Shah controlled the flow of information. I mean, he really held it tight. So even if you talk to someone close to the Shah, they would know part of the story, but they wouldn't know the rest of the story. So I interviewed Ardashir Zahedi, who was the Shah's ambassador to Washington in the 1970s, and he was quite forthcoming. And when he saw that I knew quite a lot of information he didn't know, he then told me his part of the story.
Mm-hmm. As you piece this material together, was there an aha moment or just a series of moments as this picture began to emerge with the documents and the interviews and the sort of the bilateral description of ongoing events?
I have to say that there were a series of real aha moments. And it wasn't until I was writing the narrative and moving through the narrative with all the strands coming together that this sort of extraordinary episode in late 1976 occurs, where there's a showdown, a confrontation between the president and the Shah over oil prices, that because no one had known about it and no one had written about it before, the nice thing for a researcher, a scholar, is that this is fresh territory. The risk is that I'm flying blind in a sense. I have to be very careful with my sources. I have to be careful in the context that I place them in. So I sort of backed up a little bit, and there were documents where I thought that they were so extraordinary, or where I could not put them into a historical context or framework, and I took them to my interviews. And I asked Schlesinger, Zaab, Scowcroft, Zahedi, did this really happen like this? And what am I not understanding this conversation, because it seems extraordinary to me. Here you're discussing an invasion of Saudi Arabia. I mean, how did that come about? Mm-hmm. So there were episodes like that.
I remember in the book, with regard to Schlesinger, you actually, on occasion, were telling the principals things that they didn't know. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that was an aha moment, actually. We had a great interview for 3 hours, and he wanted to talk about the Shah. The catastrophic failure that occurred in Iran in 1978-79 is something that the policymakers at the time are still thinking about. It really did affect their whole way of looking at US foreign policy, because it called into question their judgment, but also the whole basis for foreign policy at that time. So Schlesinger was very forthcoming, and there were on one key issue, which was this huge sale of F-14 fighter planes to Iran in the mid-70s, a sale that he had opposed as Defense Secretary and tried to challenge. The basis for the sale there was no justification for it on military or strategic terms. And so I had a transcript of one of Kissinger's conversations, and I said to him, could you read this and tell me what you think it means? Because I know what I think, but I don't want to believe what I'm looking at here. And he put his glasses on, and he was looking through it, and then he said, "Oh God," and we had an "oh God" moment. And I said to him, "I take it that this contract has been fixed," and he said, "Yes." And I said, "You didn't know that?" And he said, "No." He said, "It was never explained to me why this sale went ahead." And this is a sale for $500 million in 1973 dollars that eventually became $1.8 billion by 1977-78. It was huge. And that deal placed an enormous strain on Iran's state finances. So not only was the deal strategically, militarily, could not be justified on those grounds, financially, there was a whole other side of the equation.
Let's go back now and set the context of the book, and then we'll walk through some more of these personalities and kind of the big issues that were going on here. This is the decade of the 1970s, and American foreign policy is confronting a changing world. Nixon is the president, Kissinger is the national security advisor. Let's walk through some of the big issues for them. The Vietnam War is being drawn down. Mm-hmm. What are the implications of that for the way they're thinking about the world?
They're understanding that politically their hands are tied at home. There is this impulse towards isolationism at home, but they want to maintain U.S. power projection around the world. So how do you do that when Vietnam is still very much a hot war in '69, and it takes them several years to wind it down? In the meantime, and that's sort of on Southeast Asia, East Asia side. Meantime, in West Asia, the British have announced that they are leaving the Persian Gulf. They're pulling back east of Suez for the first time in 100 years. And the fear is that that's creating a power vacuum for the Soviets and for radical Arab nationalists in the area. This is coinciding with U.S. need for more oil. The U.S. economy is growing, it's booming at this time, and U.S. energy consumption is soaring. And U.S. oil production is about to peak. So you have this convergence of the Soviets and containment and also oil. And they had to find a way to secure West Asia and the oil fields of the Gulf, hopefully without putting any U.S. troops in there. And I suppose you could see the Nixon doctrine, in our terms, we would say what he was trying to do was outsource national security to regional allies. And I thought Schlesinger came up with such a great term in our interview, which is that the Shah was our gladiator. And we were looking for gladiators to do the fighting for us. And if we want him to fight for us, we have to give him what he needs to get the job done. That then became the real issue with the Defense Department and State Department. How much does the Shah need? Does he have the money to pay for it? And should we go so far as to give him everything he wants, or most of what he wants? So they were facing this changing world in the late 60s, early 70s. I think Nixon's relationship with the Shah is very important here, though.
And we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's just do this context, and then I'm going to walk you through the different personalities that are involved here. The state of the Cold War is what? Because this withdrawal from Asia, this new need for oil, is coming in the context of movement toward détente, yes. But on the other hand, still very great concerns that the Soviets had their eyes on the Persian Gulf.
Yes, détente. In fact, the Shah the Shah was very worried that détente would lead the US to cut a deal with the Soviets over the Persian Gulf or over Iran. And that had happened in 1941 when Iran was invaded during the war. So Nixon and Kissinger viewed détente as the best possible way forward for them to maintain US power projection while opening ties to China, sort of holding everything in place while they could get the armed forces repaired after Vietnam and draw down in Vietnam. And that created some fluidity, I think, in sectors of the Cold War, some of the frontline states. There was insecurity on the part of people like the Shah, who were strong US allies, but who were beginning to think that if there was a thaw, maybe the US security guarantees would be weakened a little bit. Maybe, and he thought, I'm going to have to look after myself. And he was very upfront with Nixon about that.
And what about the regional balance of power at this time? Because we're not just talking in a way about the Shah, but we're talking about Iraq, its neighbor. We're talking about Israel. We're talking about Turkey. So what was going on here was a struggle to define a new balance of power in the region in the context of American withdrawal from Asia and in the context of détente, but still worried about the Soviet Union.
Yes, they were looking for this centurion, I suppose, in the Persian Gulf. That Nixon and Kissinger believed they needed a launching pad in the area. Israel in 69 to 71 was a strong country, but it was a small country. Nixon had a much better relationship with the Shah. Iran was, nearly 30 million people at that time. Turkey wasn't ready for that role, and it was too far out of the area. Saudi Arabia was far too weak and vulnerable. I mean, at that time, Saudi Arabia, I think, had about 4 million people. So Iran appeared to them to be the best logical place to have this new power dichotomy in the area. Now, they were worried about Iraq, which was leaning towards the Soviets. They were also very worried about India. And I think that was one of the aspects of my research I wasn't expecting, is that they saw the Shah as balancing Indira Gandhi in India. They were very worried about Pakistan. Pakistan was right between the two countries, was chronically unstable, as it is today, and was a classic buffer state. It didn't seem to serve much purpose except to keep Iran and India away from each other and separated. And the Shah was more than willing to do that job for them, to take on the responsibilities and the defense burden after the British left. But he made it very clear, if I do this, you have to lift the restraints.
Restraints on?
On arms sales and oil prices.
I see. So, and I guess the other element here that we, of course, have to remind our audience about, which they may not be reminded about, is this is the period when Nixon is running for re-election, and the Watergate scandal begins to blossom. And
the Shah plays a key role in the 72 election campaign, we now know. There had been rumors that the Shah helped Nixon in 1960 with money. Those rumors were never proven. And then in 72, Nixon and Kissinger, especially Nixon on the political side, wants a landslide. He's prepared to do anything to get a landslide. And you see these deals being struck with the Shah. And because this was a relationship that was, when we talked about US-Iran relations in that period, it was really President Shah relations. This was very much Palace White House. The press, the public, the media, the Congress were kept out of the most pivotal aspects of the relationship, and there's very little paper trail at that time. So Nixon liked doing business with the Shah because he felt that he could conduct it on an oral, verbal basis, and they sent intermediaries back and forth between the two countries. And in late 72, as Kissinger is working on the deal in Vietnam, South Vietnam, to settle the peace accords, they turned to the Shah for urgent help in rushing military supplies to Saigon to get the South Vietnamese on board to sign the peace deal. Because President Thieu, who was the leader at that time of South Vietnam, said, I'm not going to sign unless I get security guarantees and unless I get more military supplies so that I can stand up to the North Vietnamese. And you see Nixon and Kissinger again and again in this time turning to the Shah to do favors for them. And of course that was very important for Nixon's re-election effort.
When you paint this picture, and you do that very well in the book, what we're looking at is we're looking at a kind of a new dawn in the strategic challenges the U.S. is confronting, and an administration, well, I should say Nixon and Kissinger, looking to be able to respond to that situation outside of constitutional restraints.
Yes.
So that what is, to the extent that you have the Shah as a proxy, as somebody who can carry the water as issues arise, you can do that without going to the Congress, which at this time, you know, is focusing on issues like war powers and so on.
Yes, they felt that they had to, and the Shah was quite happy to do that, they needed someone who could help them circumvent the rules. And so you see in the back channel communications with the palace, can you send material to Turkey, because Turkey was under, arms sales were embargoed to Turkey for one point. Can you send supplies to another third country? So there was a lot of shifting of manpower and material around the region, and it was all working quite nicely until Watergate happened. And this is where Nixon's political collapse starts to impact the relationship, and the Shah is actually strengthened by Watergate. So yes, I mean, they were looking for ways to circumvent the laws of the land, I suppose you could say. And Kissinger was frustrated when, after Watergate, the Congress reasserted congressional power, and those deals became very, not just risky, but quite unsound.
I get the sense in your book, once this context is defined, that on the one hand, Kissinger and Nixon had a perception of how the Shah could be used as an instrument of their power. On the other hand, I have a sense that they were making it up as they went along. And thirdly, I have a sense that there was a lot that they really didn't understand about the changes in the world economy. Is that correct? Are all three of those correct?
Yes.
And talk about, let's go back to this whole situation with oil, because again and again in your book, one gets the sense that Kissinger didn't get it. He got the power equation, yes, but he did not understand the dynamics of international economics as they were changing. And what is important here is that suddenly America needed more and more imports of oil, because we were moving from being an exporter to being a country that needed to import. At the same time, Japan and Europe were at a new threshold of recovery from the World War II, and were needing oil also.
Yes, I mean, the US, after US oil production peaks in 1970, the US enters the world energy market and is suddenly competing for oil supplies against its major trading partners. So this pits the US, Europe, and Japan, the industrialized democracies of the West, against each other for the same shrinking pool of oil. And the market tightens. And I think Nixon had more of a grasp of this than Kissinger. Nixon was beginning to understand the geopolitics of it, the economics as well as the geopolitics. But Kissinger was just not interested. I mean, there's one issue, it's one thing not to understand it, but to not understand it and also not be interested in learning about it creates a series of blind spots. And he, again and again, it seemed to me that he didn't pull in the people who could have helped him. And in fact, he pushed them away. And you see this quite interesting, I think, split between the Kissinger people, the geopolitical side, and the economics and finance people in Nixon, especially in Ford's administration, and they're the ones who start to fight back. And that the US is really caught unawares in late '73 during the Arab oil embargo. And this is where suddenly the new world has arrived at America's front door, and the country is really completely unprepared for it.
Let's now walk through Nixon's situation domestically, and then we'll talk about the Shah and how they saw each other and how that those perceptions evolved over time. So we've talked some about Nixon, Watergate, the new importance of energy, the transition in the world economy, the drawdown in Vietnam. He and Kissinger were at war with parts of their own government, yes. Both within the military and in Treasury. So this is the height of bureaucratic politics, in which everything from secret tapings by the Pentagon to leaks to columnists like Jack Anderson and so on. So they were not only at war with the media, but also with their own government.
Yes, and sometimes it seemed to me they were spending more energy against each other internally than they were dealing with some of the problems. I mean, when you talk to people like Dr. Schlesinger, there was quite an intense rivalry there with Kissinger, and information was kept from Schlesinger by Kissinger. So you have the Secretary of State actually withholding information from the Secretary of Defense involving defense and national security affairs. It sets up quite an interesting dynamic for how any issue is going to be dealt with in a functional way. So Kissinger and Nixon, of course, appreciated secrecy, great secrecy, and they believed that their own diplomats were, well, incompetent. They weren't, real men. I mean, they used all sort of language about we're the only ones who really get it. And they thought the Shah was like them, in that the Shah was his own foreign minister. It made it all too easy for them to keep going back to the Shah again and again. And whenever they would hear something from the diplomats or from the Pentagon urging caution or saying, well, Iran's economy is fragile, we shouldn't sell the Shah too many arms because it could place a debt burden on Iran's economy, that could lead to instability. They kept saying, pushing it back. No, we know what we're doing. Again, you're being nervous Nellies. I was surprised during my research, actually, that the pushback for arms sales came from two defense secretaries.
I want to go back to this thing of the world they're confronting, but they're the domestic politics, but also, so what we have is a global structure, a national security structure. So you can push a button here and push a button there in terms of moving troops, moving weapons to a particular place, and so on. But on the other hand, this is now creating stress in the constitutional system at home. And so what you have are Kissinger and Nixon as navigators in this world, willing at some point seems to pay any price to implement what they see as a geopolitical goal and a way of doing that, implementing that goal.
Yes, and they needed partners and allies to help them do it. And it was easier for them to turn to people like Pinochet, the Shah, Marcos, their gendarmes or their gladiators around the world, because they didn't have to consult their own parliaments or congresses like Nixon and Kissinger were required to do to some extent. So if they wanted to make deals and quick deals, it was very easy to go to people like the Shah, but of course the Shah had his own nationalist impulses too, and he had his own reasons for wanting to do favors with them. So Nixon and Kissinger are faced with this world that suddenly, the world of 1972 is very different from the world of early 1974, when Nixon has been crippled by Watergate, the US economy has been crippled by the oil embargo, oil prices have gone through the roof, and suddenly their strategy that looked so great on paper 2 years earlier has blown up in their faces.
And the important point here is that we know about the war with parts of the national security bureaucracy, but what emerges in this period domestically is a war with their own Treasury Department, and actually the Fed is drawn in. So the people on the economic side begin to see the economic implications of giving the Shah the ability to raise the price of oil as much as he wants and to buy as many weapons as he wants.
Yes, and it was a very sharp divide that I wasn't expecting when I began the research at all. You had the economics people who did not care very much for geopolitics, and you had the geopolitical people who did not care very much for economics, and they really couldn't build bridges between them, especially in terms of communications. Kissinger believed he was right on every issue, and he would not listen to someone like Bill Simon, who was the Treasury Secretary, because to him Simon was just a bond trader. What did Bill Simon know about the world? And Simon was also to some extent an idealist. He saw the world in moral terms, and Kissinger, of course, was the ultimate realist. And so you had that realist-idealist divide within Ford's administration that was never dealt with by the president. And of course, Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Fed, is drawn in because really by 75, the US economy has tanked. It's plunged into its deepest recession since the Great Depression. You have US banks starting to be overextended in terms of the debt burden they've taken on. At the height of the first oil shock, lending billions of dollars out to countries that may not be able to pay them back. And so you have the makings then of not only a geopolitical crisis, but a financial and economic crisis too. And always the danger is going to be that there's going to be convergence.
The Nixon-Kissinger perception of the Shah was, this is our guy. He is like us, he thinks like us, he wants to move the pawns on the chessboard, and his moves will complement our moves. So Nixon, early in the story that you're telling, gives the Shah, in a private conversation, a go-ahead to raise oil prices as much as he wants, on the one hand, and on the other hand, Nixon agrees to bypass what was called, was it the Twitchell doctrine, which was a Pentagon-imposed rule that there would be limits on the arms sales to the Shah.
Yes, those were the two means of leverage, strategic leverage the US had over the Shah and Iran at that time during the Cold War. And there'd been bipartisan consensus that the US needed to keep that leverage on oil prices and arms sales, because the two were connected, directly connected. The Shah wanted to raise oil prices and get control of his country's domestic oil production because he wanted to generate the revenues to modernize Iran, but also to transform Iran into a military powerhouse. They never really understood the extent to which he wanted to the size of the transformation he intended. But Nixon gets frustrated, you can see, in 69-70 period, because he's being told by the so-called experts, this is a bad idea. And one thing that came out of my interview with Zahedi that I was not expecting.
The Iranian ambassador to the
yes,
US.
Ardashir Zahedi, is right towards the end of our interview, we were talking about oil prices, and I mentioned this issue of, did you get the go-ahead? And he said, well, of course we did. Nixon told me. And they said, when did that happen? And he said, oh, it happened very early on in the administration, and we were in a meeting and Nixon called me to come to the back of the Oval Office and into his little study area, and he gave me the go-ahead to tell the Shah. Now, it's not documented anywhere, and I went back to the president's schedule and I found the meeting, and sure enough, the meeting did occur, and this is exactly the time when all the bureaucratic infighting is going on, and Defense Secretary Melvin Laird and Secretary of State Bill Rogers are saying to Nixon, no, no, no. Nixon's very frustrated with them, and as happens with Nixon, he goes around his own advisors, of course, with Kissinger's support. On arms sales, the Shah kept lobbying them very hard, and one form of counter-strategic leverage the Shah had was the CIA bases in northern Iran. And this is where the CIA Director Helms was very insistent that we have to keep those bases operating.
To watch the
monitor the Soviet tests.
Yeah.
They're too important, and don't worry about the arms sales. Give the Shah what he wants. If he turns those off, we're all in big trouble.
So intelligence here is rather interesting because you have information, but the global context is changing. And so which information is more important than what other information? And so you point out that giving the Shah the green light to raise oil prices, in essence, impacts the economies in Europe and in the rest of the world. But looking at Europe, what you then begin to see is economic crisis that leads to the rise of the Euro-communists, which is a concern if one's view of the world is one in which, you know, it's them against us, and communism is on the march.
Yes, I mean, in fact, some of the same countries now that are almost bankrupt in Europe were at a similar point 35 years ago. Greece, Portugal, and Spain were transitioning to Western-style democracy after years of right-wing dictatorship, authoritarian dictatorship. So they were at a very, very fragile place where Kissinger was trying to encourage their transformation, although it seems he was very skeptical about their prospects. And the real vulnerability there were their economies, which were suddenly exposed to, coming out of protectionism, suddenly exposed to a global market. And they desperately needed infusions of cash. And when they were hit by soaring fuel costs after 1973, they suddenly found themselves faced with billions of dollars worth of bills that they couldn't pay. What they did is they go to the IMF and to the World Bank, but mostly they turned to private lending institutions on Wall Street. And this is the connection we see between Kissinger's strategy with the Shah, Nixon Kissinger's strategy to raise oil prices destabilizing Southern Europe, and then Southern Europe exposing weaknesses in the US banking system.
So here we have a situation where focusing on a client who's going to become an arms depot and an actor in the region that is of great concern, giving him a green light, unleashes forces that essentially threaten America's larger geopolitical position.
Yes, you have the superpower, in essence, creates a super client. The super client then starts to manage the relationship. And this happens over time, and it's difficult for the policymakers, I think, in the US to, you give the Shah something, how do you know you're giving him too much? How do you know at which point there's a tipping point in the relationship? But certainly by 74, it's gone too far. I mean, it's really happened within a 2 or 3 year period from 71 to 74. And suddenly the Shah is the one who's, it's a case of the tail wagging the dog, I suppose you could say. But the Shah was more than a client by then, because with 32 million people, he was the dominant force within OPEC, and he was beginning to dominate the whole of West Asia. He wanted to go down into the Indian Ocean. He wanted to project Iranian power down the East African coast. There was nothing in his mind that could stop him, except money.
This analysis really leads one to the conclusion that Nixon, Kissinger, and the Shah set in motion forces with an extraordinary impact on Iran itself, leading to inflation in an unequal society, in a society that did not have the infrastructure or manpower to absorb all the monies that were now coming their way and all of the material and weapons. Talk a little about that, because in a way, the Shah and American policy sets in motion the implosion of that country.
Yes, Iran's economy essentially imploded earlier than I think we thought. Really, by the summer of '74, you're seeing double-digit inflation, the economy's heating up, and this is the point at which most of the oil stimulus has not actually hit the Iranian economy yet. The stimulus from 1973, when oil prices rose fourfold. But they were warned. I mean, the CIA, they didn't, I wouldn't say they did these exhaustive analysis of what might happen, but they did warn Kissinger and Nixon that the Shah was driving Iran's economy too hard. He had a history of doing that. And that's why we had leverage over him, to try and make the transformation of Iran to a pro-Western secular state manageable. The Shah wanted to go too quickly. And the stimulus was a bit like a drug overdose for a patient that couldn't absorb the drug within their system. I mean, the whole country was high on the fumes of oil profits in '74, '75. And unfortunately, a great deal of that money was wasted, squandered, and ended up in the pockets of people who were engaged in corrupt practices, some of them American, most of them Iranian. And so Iran's economy starts shaking in '74. By '75, it's actually headed into a recession. And this is when you see the first explosion of unrest in Iran. You see, especially in '77, the people who were the first to be laid off were young, unskilled, uneducated men from the provinces who had poured into the Iranian cities to work on construction projects. They tended to be more religious, conservative. When they were thrown out of work, they're standing on street corners looking for something to do, so they were the kindling for the revolution to come.
And what we missed, and if the Shah didn't miss it, he didn't do anything about it, was really the rise of the mullahs, basically, and the extent to which an Iranian tradition of Islam, and a conservative Islam, an extreme Islam, a Shia Islam emerges and becomes the motor behind the dissent.
He was more Western in his thinking. He was as Western in his thinking as Nixon and Kissinger were, and I guess in that post-World War II era, when there was the liberal secular era, the Shah believed. In 1963, he used force to put down an uprising that Ayatollah Khomeini was involved in, and that was regarded at the time by the Americans and by the Iranian political establishment as the final victory over the mullahs. In fact, he just pushed them underground, and the unrest began simmering like a volcano. Not once in any of the documentation did I find an analysis by the US of how economic problems in Iran would benefit the clergy. The threat to the Shah was always seen coming from the left, never seen coming from the right, let alone the religious right. I mean, the idea that priests could overthrow a king was something beyond the comprehension of certainly beyond Kissinger's comprehension. They did know who Khomeini was. They had a general sense. But the Shah's power base was regarded as authoritarian right. So the fear would always be a nationalist coup from the left, another Mossadegh, and they were really quite agitated by Gaddafi at this time. Gaddafi was providing an alternative model for young people in the region. The more radical, the better. And the old-style conservative monarchies of the Pahlavis in Iran, the Saudis, were seen as out of step with what was going on in the region.
The end of your story is really the turn away from the Shah by the U.S. government. Nixon leaves office, Ford comes in, and an alignment between the economic forces in the government and Treasury with the Saudis. And so this is a pivotal moment in history where the U.S. government embraces the Saudis. The Saudis show restraint in the pricing of oil. They put the Shah in his place, saying, no, there will be caps on the rise of price, and they open the spigots of their oil reserve, which it's an amazing story.
Yes.
And both the story of Iran and the story of our new relations, our reinforced relations with the Shah, set the stage for today's world.
Yes, I was wondering when I did the research the extent to which US policymakers at that time understood what they were doing. I mean, did they really want a new relationship with the Saudis on that scale? Was I looking at the material from hindsight and making, was I reading something into it? But it was actually General Scowcroft who gave me he to some extent broke the mystery of this new relationship in our interview, which was right at the end of the book writing process. And he was the one who used the phrase breaking OPEC. Breaking OPEC. I hadn't dared use the phrase breaking before because it seemed like such a dramatic thing to say, such a severe use of words. And he said, no, we were trying to break OPEC. What we wanted to break OPEC without hurting the Shah. So they had this plan for the Saudis to flood the market. They were very concerned about the Shah's, what was going on in inside Iran already by '76. They were concerned about the Shah's behavior, and they wanted to dislodge the grip he had over OPEC's decision-making process because Iran was the dominant member of the cartel. They were always waiting for the Saudis to kind of step up to the plate. By '76, you see a realignment happening. The Saudis are feeling ready to confront Iran within OPEC, but they want US security guarantees before they do it. Quite sensibly too. So they cut the deal, and the power struggle goes ahead within OPEC. The Iranians are driven out of the market after oil prices are held down through '77, and I said to General Scowcroft, were you aware that within 9 days of that happening, Iran's oil revenues collapsed by 38%? And I said it got worse from there on out. And he acknowledged that it seemed to be something he hadn't thought of much before. But I asked him, did you do risk analysis of what would happen to the Iranian economy if oil prices didn't go up in 1977? Because I said, I know you did a risk analysis for the US economy if they went up, but did you look at what would happen to the producers? And he said yes, which surprised me. I mean, they were thinking and they were trying to help anticipate possible trouble with Iran. But he said they underestimated the severity of the financial problems facing the Shah. And that really was quite an interesting thing to say. And it shows some of the problems policymakers have in government all the time. The Shah was withholding information from them. Kissinger was certainly either withholding it or not understanding what was happening to Iran's economy at that time. So that when they went ahead with the plan to break OPEC, in fact, they did cause severe damage to Iran's economy.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk now about personalities in history, because the center of the stage here is the Shah, Nixon, Kissinger. Do you see similarities in their personalities and their context that led them to collaborate and then turn on each other? The Shah, we should make note of, was during this period keeping secret the fact that he was dying of cancer.
Yeah, that's the wild card in the story, which is quite a dramatic one too. I think Nixon and Kissinger and the Shah saw themselves, well, Kissinger was trained. The Shah and Nixon were self-taught geopoliticians. And you could say that they was almost like auto-intoxication when they were together in a room, because they saw each other through this realist perspective. They did not take into account, at least Nixon and Kissinger never took into account nationalism, religion, culture, history, ethnicity of the client state. The Shah, on the other hand, this is where there was a difference. The Shah was a Persian nationalist. Yes, he was an ally of the US, but he's always going to put Iran's interests first. This is a problem with the whole Nixon doctrine, of course. That's one of the weaknesses of it. The client wants to protect and safeguard his own power base. Sometimes that's going to happen at the cost of a clash or confrontation with the protector, the great power, the US. So they got on very well, and Nixon and the Shah and Kissinger saw the world in deeply pessimistic terms. Darkness was always an hour away, and the conversations were relentlessly dour, and the Soviets are going to take over, and we're in this power struggle between light and dark. I think that's what they had in common. I think that what they didn't have in common was obviously the nationalist impulse on the Iranian side.
Mm-hmm. What are the lessons, do you think, of your book when one reads it, and it really reads like a novel? So many of the themes that recur today are in this book. The impact of the change in the oil environment, the need for energy, the search for a new kind of global balance, the economic spillover to Europe and the rest of the world, and so on. So I guess what I want to ask is what would you like people to get, first policymakers, to get out of this history?
Better communication, understanding, looking at a regional issue or a local issue and pulling back and looking at the bigger picture, trying to get a bigger picture and doing different sort of risk analysis. I think that's one lesson that I certainly learned from the research. And it's something that scholars have done ever since the revolution, and it's something I realized I did not want to do, was to look at US-Iran relations just within that perspective. I found that I had to pull back and look at this on a much bigger framework. So economics and finance are always going to be factors in the geopolitical equation. When oil just it's an issue that the US foreign policy establishment, Washington in general, has been unable to come to grips with. And again and again and again, this country has, the policymakers, the presidents go on, every term there's a president who goes on, we have to confront our addiction to oil. Nothing happens. Now, imports of foreign oil have declined in the last couple of years. It's not because we're getting more efficient, it's because the economy is really bad. When the economy picks up, we'll go back to the bad old ways unless there's leadership from Washington. So it's really to show, also one lesson is just these pernicious impact of oil as a commodity, that sole commodity on American life and American power projection around the world.
The question of intelligence, because that is a theme that runs through your book. The CIA and our analysts did not adequately see the risks domestically in Iran. They focused on the Soviet Union. The paradigm that Nixon and Kissinger were working with did not incorporate economics, basically, and so on. So what this sounds like a tune that we're still humming today, in the sense that, for example, the Iranian situation, we know very little about what's going on internally there.
Yes, that's exactly right. And the Iranian economy will be key to the future survival of the Iranian regime. I know the Saudis know that. The Saudis have been quite vocal about it, and just 3 months ago, a senior member of the Saudi royal family was in the UK. He gave a speech which mysteriously appeared verbatim in British newspapers, in which he said the soft spot for the regime in Iran is its economy, and we can affect that by squeezing their oil profits. I can't imagine that the US is not aware of the damage that the Saudis could cause to the Iranians if other aspects of the Iranian power dynamic are vulnerable at that time, because you can crash the market and hurt Iran's economy, but if the regime is strong within the eyes of the people, it might not do any damage. The Shah at that time is very vulnerable. So it seems to me that the economic equation is very important, and they did not have an understanding at the time. It was almost like a hazing for US foreign policy establishment after '73.
Hazing?
Hazing in terms of the fact that they believed the world was a certain way, and they were caught. You know, economics is a very tough master, I think. It was as though they were being taught on the job, day by day. We've lost control. We can't control this economy anymore. And when you have someone like Alan Greenspan working for Ford at that time saying it's the economy, the economy, the economy, the American people have to be told that their way of life is changing very dramatically. That conversation is never had.
Mm-hmm. Is there a particular insight that this history offers us about the present situation?
Well, we seem to be repeating the present situation. So to me, it's
repeating the past.
Repeating the past, yes.
Yeah.
It's history repeating itself. I suppose we could say that that's quite depressing from a historical perspective, although historians wouldn't be surprised. I think that this book might be helpful for policymakers working today to know that another president also had to deal with Iran seeking nuclear weapons, vulnerable US banks, weak Southern Europe. Why are these factors, why are we seeing this convergence happening now? Are they going to respond in the way that Ford did? Are they going to respond in other ways? Are they going to, I'm sure they are responding in ways that we don't know about. But that risk analysis, looking at what could happen if we do one thing over here, they may be focused on here, but on the other side, you also have to be looking around you all the time.
And I think that a lesson also, if I may say, is that the desperation of our leaders, where they close the circle of information, is very detrimental, both for the region, the states in the region, and for America's long-term interest.
Because they're only talking to themselves.
Yeah.
And when you operate in secrecy at the highest levels, the air is not it's not fresh air coming in and fresh perspectives. And we all understand why they have to make decisions in secrecy, but you can't shut the actual experts out within your own bureaucracy.
On that note, Andrew, let me show your book again, Oil Kings, How the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia Changed the Balance of Power in the Middle East. It's a great read, and we couldn't cover everything, so people should go out and buy the book. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.